Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully having an amazing day. I'm going to kick this video off discussing a very interesting leak for the Intel i9-13900K. While we've seen previous benchmarks of these processors appear online before the official debut, this is a little different because this is essentially a comprehensive review of a retail sample of the chip. Now, this is being conducted by ECSM Official, also known as Enthusiastic Citizen, as well as One Raichu. I will leave a link to both in the video description. Before we get into the actual performance results, let's discuss the setup, shall we? Because I think that's pretty important. The CPU is being tested against an i9-12900KF. And both CPUs are basically set up very similarly. For a cooler, it's an NZXT Kraken X73 AIO, and the motherboard is being utilized is an ASRock Z690. Now, this has been updated to the 12.01 BIOS, and this is the major caveat I have with this. Essentially, this is the latest version of the BIOS right now, but obviously, these processors have not been released to the market, officially anyway. So this BIOS could be updated to, let's just say for sake of discussion, version 13, and that could bring some performance improvements. It could reduce power consumption. It could make you toast in the morning. I don't know if it's really going to make that much of a difference because essentially the architecture is so similar. When it comes to Ryzen 7000, I've been hearing, and there's been a lot of discussion online, that AMD are releasing a lot of BIOS updates as we get closer and closer, of course, to the official release of those processors. And obviously there are a plethora of changes for AM5 over AM4. So I think that, you know, if, for example, a full review leaked of, let's say, the 7950X, I would think this would be a much larger concern, the BIOS revision. With that said, again, we could be seeing a few % additional performance or power consumption go down, and of course this is only a single review. Either way, aside from that, the memory being used is either DDR5 6000 MTS with a latency of CL30 or 3600 with CL17. So this is a pretty good indicator of how this processor will perform versus its predecessor. We'll get into specifics in just a moment, but let's just take a look at a couple of nice overviews. The first of which is Cinebench 15, 20, and 23. I think the results largely speak for themselves. I don't really feel like I need to go over them too much. There is quite a meaningful difference across different applications. Obviously, at the end of the day, we are looking at the same number of performance cores, but the efficient cores, if I can speak, they have increased in number, and there seems to be a small increase in IPC. The performance cores don't seem to have much, but the efficient cores are a few additional %. Now, obviously, there are some changes aside from this. We have higher clock frequencies for Raptor Lake, and L3 has also seen an increase in size. Now, when it comes to power consumption, things get a little bit interesting, and I'm going to leave power consumption figures until a little later. There's also a nice comparison between a run of CPU-Z versus 13900K versus the 12900, and again, I think it pretty much speaks for itself. Single thread goes up a little bit, but really the major advantage here, of course, for the 13th generation lies in the multi-thread performance. Speaking of multi-thread, there's a very nice comparison of various applications from, as again, Cinebench, CPU-Z, WinRAR, Queen, and also it gives us an average as well. We're looking at essentially 142% for the 13th generation versus the 12th generation, so that's quite meaningful. In terms of games, according to their results, it's around a 10% increase. This is across several games which are being tested, but they are basically CPU-bound games, such as CSGO, which of course really hammers a couple of threads only, and then something like Ashes of the Singularity, which, despite the fact that the engine is a lot old now, and it's certainly not a flawless test, it does leverage a large number of threads. Utilizing both DDR5 as well as DDR4, we can see that the 13900K with DDR5 scores 762. The orangey results are basically at 1080p, the blue results are at 1440p or 2K if you prefer. What's really important here, of course, is this being tested with a 6900 XT, so there is quite a lot of GPU grunt. DDR4 memory sees a small regression in performance, but ultimately it's not that big of a difference. And then, of course, you can see the results of the 12900 essentially are quite close. We're looking at around a 90 frame, not 90%, that would be very strange, a 90 frame deficit between the 13th generation and the new generation processors. So ultimately, this is a case of Intel's new generation chips are doing pretty interesting things, but it's not probably going to be convincing you to upgrade. If you're already fairly happy with a 12900K, we're looking at a 42% on average multi-thread performance increase, 12.5% single thread, and 10% for gaming. Again, I don't think this is really going to change too much when it comes to the final revision BIOSes, maybe a 1 or 2% here or there. But as for power consumption, utilizing AIDA 64, so this is not necessarily what you would expect for gaming, but either way, 253 watts, which is kind of hungry hippo land, but using unlimited power, as Mr. Palpatine would say, then it goes up to 343 watts. Now, this is a stress test, and again, this is not necessarily what you would expect from gaming, but yeah. I personally am going to be very interested to see how all of this unfolds versus the next generation Ryzen processors. I suspect there's going to be an awful lot of cope and a lot of arguments depending on your particular setup. I don't necessarily think there's going to be a simple answer for upgrading. Just for the sake of discussion, even taking Intel out of the equation, if you've got a decent DDR4 setup and you have like a decent AM4 board, I imagine with the prices of the 5800X3D coming down, a number of people, if you're doing gaming only, I mean, obviously if you're doing something else entirely like 3D rendering or content creation or whatever, then that's completely different. But I imagine the 5800X3D is going to be really popular with the prices coming down at the moment. And it's going to be very interesting to see how all of this unfolds, especially given people could also be discussing, well, do I go with like a cheap 13th generation processor and a cheaper DDR4 board? Do I go with like, the Zen 3 based system? Do I go whole hog? Do I wait until the Vcache processors come out for Ryzen, which is allegedly going to be early-ish next year? I'm hearing it's going to be announced at CES, but honestly, that's kind of up and down. Like, I've heard some people tell me that it's going to be a little later. I personally am kind of guessing it's going to be CES, but who knows? Anyway, switching from one thing that isn't too surprising to one that I think most would agree shook the internet. I'm a day late with this, but I'm kind of glad I waited because now Nvidia have given us a response. You can see the quote yourself on screen, and I'll also leave a link to the Gamers Nexus video. But long story short, giving you a TLDR, EVGA has terminated its relationship with Nvidia, and they are no longer manufacturing video cards of any type. So this basically means that there's going to be no AMD cards and no Radeon cards. There's going to be no Intel Arc cards, and of course, there is no longer Nvidia cards. Now, before we get into speculation about this, I just want to mention that if you already own an RTX card from EVGA, then you will still be covered by their policies. So, for the sake of discussion, if you have a card and it falls over, it explodes, whatever, they will repair it, and they do have replacements left for customers. But they have already mentioned, I mean, this I found particularly intriguing. Andrew Han, who is the CEO, said, and I quote, "The company already made 20 EVT samples of EVGA RTX 4090 for the win free cards, but they are not moving to production, and is, quote, killed all active projects pertaining to cards." Now, what's really interesting, aside from the fact that they are one of the more prolific Nvidia board partners, probably one of the most respected, I actually have some friends who will only go with EVGA. Let me know, by the way, what's your experience? I've had a couple of EVGA cards before. I think the first EVGA card I had was a I think it was a 670 for the win. And that thing was fast. It was almost as fast as like a 680, I think, in reviews. It was really good. I can't remember the other card I have from them. Anywho, allegedly 75% of the revenue comes for EVGA comes from their GPUs alone. That's a lot of money. Now, Nvidia have made a statement for this. They've said, and I quote, "We've had a great partnership with EVGA and we will continue to support them on our current generation of products. We wish Andrew," who is the CEO, Andrew Han, "and all of our friends at EVGA the best." And basically, it seems that they are just, well, citing multiple issues working with Nvidia. Obviously, at the end of the day, we're only hearing things from their side. Nvidia are obviously not really saying too much about this. But let's face it, with the RTX 40 series incoming, you know, potentially there's a lot of money to be made. We all know that the next generation cards are going to be popular. We all know, even without mining, that people want these damn cards. The problem is the Founders Editions are typically able to undercut. With that said, there are also people who don't give a crap about the Founders Edition cards and only want their specific brand, whether that's MSI, whether that's EVGA. You know how people always kind of gravitate towards one thing or another. I'm going to be very interested to see how this actually shapes up for EVGA, whether they actually end up regretting this decision. Because again, it's like 75% of your revenue. Now, they apparently are not even wanting to cut the number of, at least to my understanding, they're not wanting to cut the number of staff for their company. So it's like, you know, imagine your salary basically going down like 75%. That's substantial. I'm going to be interested to see. Maybe they're going to pivot towards other products. You have to imagine so. I'm also curious. I'm trying to find out why they're not going towards AMD, because RDNA 3 I think is going to be quite competitive. It may be something to do with a contract. Maybe they have some exclusivity arrangement with AMD, with Nvidia, which is going to be lasting for a certain amount of time. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting time of it, given that essentially the RTX 40 cards are basically right around the corner. They are leaving a lot of money on the table, honestly. But will this hurt Nvidia? Probably not. They're still going to be selling their cards through the Founders Edition. MSI and all of their other partners are just going to be happy to take up the slack, honestly. So if anything, I'm sure MSI, Galax, and any other company are going to be rubbing their hands together, because it just means additional allocation for them in product samples. So yeah, with that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. Leave a likey on the video. And of course, when RTX 40 announcement occurs, we will be fully covering it. I'm very, very, very excited to see what the next generation of products from both AMD and Nvidia is going to bring to the table. Things like path tracing I think could be really cool. At the end of the day, though, I am perhaps most interested at this point, not so much in the performance even, but pricing and marketing of these products. Especially SKU for SKU, so how AMD versus Nvidia, excuse me, are going to be marketing their products, pricing their products, and just the availability in general. With that said, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.